So Dr. NEILL DE PAOLI is no stranger to most of us. NEILL has been digging up the town of Bristol for about 50 years. He came in the early 1970s and began, along with Helen Camp and Bob Bradley, our own Chuck Rand, digging up colonial Pemaquid and looking archaeologically at the different findings there. NEILL went to Brown University, where he received his BA. He then went on for a PhD to the University of New Hampshire and did a special degree there in archaeology. NEILL has been the adjunct professor at Southern Maine Community College, as well as he has worked with Old Berwick Historical Society for many, many years.
Also OBHS.
OBHS.
So it gets a little confusing.
So, of course, now NEILL is the park manager of Colonial Pemaquid, and it was he who, of course, put in the wonderful exhibit there entitled Guns, Politics, and Furs there at the actual museum. He also is having a book coming out fairly soon, within the next 2 years, we hope, by the same title. So would you join with me now in giving a warm welcome to NEILL.
So the title that I picked sort of says a lot about at least my look at the Pemaquid Falls neighborhood, as I refer to it as. In that at first glance you see a tract of land that for a long time was a commercial enterprise, lastly by the Poole, well, not lastly, but most notably by the Poole brothers. And you see this old building and think, well, that looks like a mill, you know, possibly. Water sources there, etc. But for me, what has made it exciting is not only being part of peripherally the project that's been going on for the last year plus as far as saving this site. I remember worrying about the site as far back as the early 2000s and wondering after it went from the Poole brothers, where would it go next? Literally and figuratively. And so that for me began impetus to make some forays into the basement and see what was down below, what you didn't see normally. And that got me really excited, from the turbine to the well for the water wheel, or so we think, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond that, what's interesting about this site is that it's tied in with so many other elements of the neighborhood. There is, and I know this because I've dug on 2 of those sites, kitty corner to the mill building, basically northwest. Gene Rottner's property I dug there for about 10 years, had field schools there for a number of years, and actually we have 2 alumni, so to speak, of the field school. And we were looking at what is Robert Given's home, so one of the owners of the mill property. So you have an archaeological site that's tied in with the mill building. Then if you go down towards the shore at where the river empties into the salty part of the Pemaquid River, there's another site. The shipyard site, a very imaginable name I came up with, but anyway, and that was the site of a shipyard that spawned one of Oakman Ford's ships, the Vandalier, that you'll hear about in a little bit, who was one of the owners of Gene Rottner's house and that property and the mill business, et cetera, et cetera. We actually have archaeological remains of that shipyard, and there was a shipyard operating there possibly as far back as the late 1600s, but I don't want to spill the beans on it too much. And probably the property just south of the falls, Alex Baudet's property, may have been the site of an even earlier mill, possibly the 17th century mill that I have made references to on a number of occasions. It's still a little bit more iffy on that. And beyond that, a rich amount of written documentation from the census records, town records, deeds, probate inventories that have been chased down by myself, Bill Kelly, who's done an amazing amount of work in the last couple of months and has generously passed that stuff on to me along with OBHS as a whole. Those of you not familiar with this, there's actually 3 sets of falls from the mill building down, but if you go upriver on the fresh side, or more of the fresh side, there's some smaller sets there, and Gene Rottner set me straight fairly recently on this end of the story. That was referred to as the little fresh, the middle fresh, and either the big fresh or the fresh.
Big fresh.
Big fresh, thank you. I've never been up to the big fresh yet, but I've been to the others. And that in itself is a whole nother story. So that, and the element I may not have mentioned is that we have a rich oral tradition in Pemaquid, town of Bristol, that has added a lot of information on the latter part of the years, the 18 and 1900s, when the mill was still running. But in most cases, you're on coastal Maine, you have some folks that precede the Europeans. No surprise to them, but sometime to us. Okay, let's back up. So the Native Americans, and this we're looking at just a sample in these next 2 slides of what was found on the CR lot, or the JR lot, Gene Rottner lot, across the way from her house and Oakman Ford's house. Not surprisingly, quite rich. You're just looking at a very small sample. We've, over the 10 years I was digging there, probably found somewhere in the order of about 18,000 artifacts, fragmented in most cases. What you're looking at here is some projectile points. This is what's referred to as a Levana point. This guy here too. These go back to around 1400 up to just about contact, so the early 1600s. This guy in the middle is a bit earlier. This would, educated guess, possibly a couple thousand years ago. We found a mudstone celt that is just about this big and was used basically to, actually not a celt, a pestle that would have been used to grind up corn, things along those lines. And that was dated by Bruce Bork, who was a very well-known Maine prehistorian, about 5,000 to 5,500 years ago. So that's probably the earliest this dates to, based on the evidence we have here and along with the ceramics, up to just about the time that the English show up in the late 1620s. Why would they come there? What would be attractive to English and Native Americans if you were looking at Pemaquid Falls?
The water. Fresh water.
The water, fresh and salt. Water to drink, water to power your mill, in the cases of Native Americans, spawning grounds for anadromous fish, for eels, shad, salmon, alewives that we still see some of these days. And so consequently they're there. You have deer coming there. It was a magnet for Native Americans for those reasons and others. And good, amazingly fertile land, which is the thing that, one of the things that made me nervous about, is the fact that you have this beautiful property that's overlooking the river, flat as a pancake. Who also likes that kind of land today? Developers. So, there you go. But anyway, so that was an interesting story, still not well understood from my standpoint. I'm not a prehistorian, but essentially what I want to do, I had started years ago and the project never was finished, to have some undergraduates look at this collection, and it would be a great opportunity for a term paper or possibly a thesis. So I'm hoping to get in touch with some profs at USM to see if they'd be willing to plug into that, or have their students plug into that. So the 17th century is a bit fuzzier as far as Pemaquid Falls goes. What I do know is that you had about 5 families living up to the falls by around 1650, 1651. And this is not, again, based on something on the dates I just pulled out of the air. When I was doing my dissertation, I was looking at the whole of Pemaquid in the 1600s, which takes you all the way from Monhegan, Damerscove, up to present-day Damariscotta. In the course of looking at that, I found out that there were 5 or 6 families, one of which included Thomas Elbridge. Thomas Elbridge is the youngest son of Giles Elbridge, who's the junior partner of the 2 partners from Bristol, England, who purchased Pemaquid in 1612, Monhegan in 1626. The patent is about 6 years later. Everybody got that so far? So that's our English connection. He comes over escaping the English Civil Wars. He's land rich, cash poor. Basically, Bristol, England was a royalist city and was trashed by the parliamentarians, Oliver Cromwell and all that kind of stuff. So he was hit hard, as were his father and brother, John Elbridge, who inherited initially. Anyway, he's there. We have 2 retired fishermen living up there, and 2 or 3 other families I'm blanking out right now. Thomas Giles, John Giles' father, who I've been studying John Giles for quite a while, had a farm up there along with his home and tavern down on the same property that the Dodges live on today. Mike and Nan Dodge, those of you know them, the stone's throw from the fort. So they're up there and they're fishing, they're farming, etc. Why possibly a mill? As I've suggested before, some of you have heard that before. One, you consider the location, you consider the waterfalls itself, the drop that you get. It's the most substantial drop on that section of the Pemaquid River that you get anywhere, so that is a good potential source of water. Secondly, we have found back in the late 1980s a little ship's model. Some of you probably heard this story before by a geologist by the name of Bill Marshall. And anyway, it was looked at by a maritime historian in England years ago, and he essentially looked at it and considered it to date probably from the late 1600s, the shape itself and the whole ball of wax. That was found on the site of the shipyard. When we dug there in the early 2000s, the earliest we found, there wasn't a lot of stuff datable, not surprisingly, because you're on a shipyard. One of the things that's prohibited is smoking on site. So we don't find many, if any, clay smoking pipes, which are one of our useful tools to date a site. But we did have someone do a dendrochronological sample, took a sample off one of the ship's ways itself. And interesting enough, they came up with a date that is within months. It was built somewhere between the wood that they found there, or we found, was laid down somewhere between the fall of 1809 and the spring of 1810. Now, if anybody have a problem with that accuracy, let me know. It's kind of tight dating. What that is not telling us is whether it predates that. I'm reasonably confident it probably did, but that's up for another person or myself, maybe, in another day. And then thirdly, we have an interesting reference that was made by the folks that were resettling Pemaquid in the resettlement period in the 1730s and 40s. And they come up there, these are Scots-Irish immigrants, and they see on site a 10-foot wide canal that was about 4 to 6 feet deep. And in it were trees that were growing that were upwards of 20 to 30 years old. And those of you who have heard me say this before, humor me, but anyway, think about that. These people here in the 1730s or 40s, no one of European descent was living there because they were burnt out in 1689. So it's logical to come up to the conclusion, not 100%, but pretty good, that this was an archaeological feature, some kind of industrial feature that was operating probably in the late 1600s. Sawmills too were critical to any community at that point in time. You do have pit saws that are not water driven, but at that point you have a water source like that. So that's the possibility, and maybe at some point in time we'll find something like that on the site of the mill. So we're now going to fast forward to 1761. I know it says 63 on the map there. That's when Robert Given, one of these, he's American born, but he is the son of, we think, of David Given, who actually ships over to Pejebscot, modern day Brunswick, your neck of the woods, as far as school goes, in the mid-17 teens. And they worked their way up to Newcastle, up to Pemaquid, places along the way over the next, let's say, 25, 30 years. And Robert Given purchases property right at the falls in 1761. That's the first purchase. He makes about, between there and Newcastle, about 10, 12 purchases over the next 15 years or so. He dies in 1797. In this time, he comes as is identified initially in 1761 and I think 63 as a mariner. Not a bad occupation to have, but you're not top of the heap. But by 1772, he's identified as a gentleman, and since from then on is until his death. And that says a lot. He's established himself. He's a selectman, town selectman in 1765 when Bristol's established. He has a sawmill on site. Now, we don't know from that particular image there how early that was. We do have a little problem, I still do at least, in that this is presumably where we were digging. You'll see a picture of one of the parts of the cellar hole. And if you were to look at that cellar hole and try and line it up with the mill building that's there today, that works. But this guy is upriver. That's been my assumption. In some ways, it also runs against why you would set a mill up or where you set a mill up. Why wouldn't you put it lower where you have a better power source? But so that's still one of the sort of puzzles as part of this bigger puzzle that we're looking at. But nonetheless, we have Robert Given there. And as you can see, he's got property right along the river, the west side. And his neighbor is, well, the heirs of Henry Fawcett, who is another heavy hitter as far as that goes. And this is another shot. We would be right up here, probably somewhere. This may be Robert Given's house here as of 1772. This is the DeBar's map, and this is a series of maps that were done by a British cartographer between the late 1760s and early 1770s, and they cover the whole eastern seaboard. And if you're looking for some great, very accurate and informational packed maps, this is one to look for. They cover all of New England and up to Nova Scotia, essentially. And archaeologically, what we found there were the cellar hole to his house, Robert Given and Jane Given, his wife, and their kids. And along with that, not surprisingly, personal items. What we're looking at here are two fragments. And these could have been, they're nicer pieces, but not top of the line necessarily. There were others that were. What you're looking at here is a piece of early creamware. This would have been a soup plate, and probably the same here. This is a cream-colored ware, an earlier version of that dating to the 1750s. This probably early 1760s or so. And there is one of the walls to the cellar. And here is the cellar itself. The beginning of that's right down to subsoil. And a well-laid wall. And it really varies as far as what we found. There's some sections were in great shape, others were not. And that probably had more to do with what happens after that site was abandoned. Plowing. Think of some of the stories that I've recounted that you might have heard or you've read yourselves back to colonial Pemaquid. Farmers don't like stone. They see plenty of it as it is, that's there naturally, but when you have a cellar hole to a house that that's been abandoned or paving, it's a pain in the you-know-what. So the plows, in this case, didn't, but in other cases probably had disturbed a fair amount of what we saw. Other places, it's in pretty good shape. Along with that, we had some items that did point to his social stature. This is I think, one of the neater finds, and we found fairly early on, I think around 2003. We stopped digging there in 2011. These are silver cufflinks with gold foil in the middle, and I've tried to figure out whether that was some kind of inscription there or whatnot. Hard to say. And this is a quartz bezel, so it's not a precious stone, but nonetheless the settings tell you a lot. And look, oh, come on. So let's go back. Interestingly enough, on one of my trips over to Saratoga Battlefield, not far from where I grew up, I found another set of these cufflinks. Not all that different, slightly different color, set in silver, and here you have a date, worn by General John Burgoyne of Saratoga Battlefield fame, etc. So that's a kind of a neat fix as far as that goes. And not only that, but a virtually untouched spigot that would have been plugged into quite possibly a cask of wine. Wine was the drink at this point in time of the well-to-do. Us common folks would more apt to be drinking country cider, hard or sweet, small ale, beer, things like that. Anyway, this was found on site, so again, testifying to Mr. Gibbons's social stature, along with a number of gun flints. Not surprisingly there, muskets are still a firearm that are necessary. At this point, we're essentially out of the last of the European, Indian, and English wars in this part of New England. It's moved up into the interior so that they're more apt to have been used for hunting purposes. We also found evidence of a blacksmith shop on site. That's a little bit more puzzling. That may have, I'm guessing that was actually used after the Gibbons had abandoned the property, but I'm not sure. And we found gun parts too. That's not uncommon. You have a blacksmith. Oftentimes they did some gunsmithing on their own, and they would take old muskets that were outdated and take off a cock that was broken, put in a new one, maybe convert it to a percussion cap, cock, things along those lines. So that's probably what we're looking at in those particular artifacts. So Robert Gibbon also had a sawmill, and later in time, and we know this in part from Jane, his wife, a fulling mill. Now, fulling is a process, and I tried at the last minute to try and find a good image of a fulling mill, and I found some, but not enough, and I'm not a tech genius, so I couldn't show that to you tonight. But essentially, fulling was a process where you're taking cotton, cotton wool, and you're basically pounding the heck out of it to basically make it into a piece of cloth. And by the time you're into the 1700s, you have water-driven fulling machinery that will essentially be pounding this wool until it's very dense, and it's going to be washed and the whole process. So I can't enlighten you much more on that at this point, but nonetheless, these were the two operations that we know were going on during his heyday. And interestingly enough, when we move on into Thomas Miller, who buys the property from the Gibbon family, continues that process. Jane Gibbon is living here until 1819 when she dies. And in the process, we get a pretty interesting look at not only what she owned at the time, but what Robert Gibbon, because this is what she would have inherited, and as long as she's alive, she has this land, but she dies and it goes on to the male heirs. All the way down to probably the Great Falls. How far below I could, whether the shipyard site, it's pretty darn close. I can't say for sure, but it's possible that was within his property. And then look where else she owns land. This is more water sources and timber sources. And it's described in his will, Robert Gibbons' will. He owns up to, I think, was it Boyd's Pond, which again would have been a source of water to impound with a dam or dams, as we've seen in as recently as the 1940s. There were 2 dams above the bridge that crosses over the Pemaquid River that were set and used by Chester Poole and Carl Sr., excuse me. So same idea, you have a wood source to cut this timber for your own use, firewood, house building, shipbuilding, etc. So they were well set up. When she dies, she owns 374 acres of land, and much of that was woodland for the reasons that I've just described. Okay, this is where it gets even more interesting. I have more material on the Gibbons story, but not digested enough to throw it at you right now. Oakman Ford is a Newcastle boy and ends up in Bristol Mills by the late 1820s along with his brother Benjamin. And they actually have a mill at Bristol Mills. So they've already started getting into the mill business. By 1835, thereabouts, he moves to Pemaquid Falls. And he stays there until his death in 1865. And in that time, he really takes off financially, not only in milling, but shipbuilding to a certain degree. Shipping itself, very convenient. He owns 2 ships that we know of, the Vandalier that you'll hear a little bit more about in a few minutes, and the Mary in 1842 when he's declared insane, thanks to Bill Kelly, and we're still early on in this story here, but I'll get back to that in a minute, and if I don't, someone raise their hand and say, well, what do you mean by that? Why, who was he really insane? Anyway, this is Gene Rodner's house, and it also was Oakman Ford and William Ford, his son's house. Built around 1835, 1840. And as I may have mentioned to some of you folks in one of an informal conversation or last fall at the 1812 house, actually no, hadn't found it at that point. I have had access to 3, 4, 5 of Gene's account books, and these are amazing. One of them is Oakman Ford's, best I can tell. Another is Francis Wheeler. Francis Wheeler is literally about a half a mile upriver from where Oakman Ford lived, and he is dealing with Oakman Ford and a number of other people in the town of Bristol. So it's neat to know that he's literally that close to where we have another site identified as far as Francis Wheeler goes. In Francis Wheeler's account book are some interesting references to a lot of window glass that he's purchasing, Oakman Ford, in the early 1840s. And a lot of nails of different sizes, 2 penny, 5 penny, 10 penny, etc. Those could be going into 2 possibilities, and I would think they're fairly reasonable. One, improvements on the mill that we know of, and or his house, Oakman Ford's house, since we don't have that hammered down exactly. And as is suggested here, he also was in the milling business. And that shows up early on, and it does show up in this document where Oakman Ford in 1842 has been declared insane, which I find rather interesting. It's a great document, but basically it's a probate inventory along with some other legal documents that are stating that this committee is going to inventory his property and an executive will take care of Oakman Ford. So a lot of great information on as far as mill operation, but the conundrum, he's insane. He lives until 1865. He's postmaster of Pemaquid Falls in 1865, 1864, 63, 62. Maybe he's an insane postmaster, but something's a little fishy there. He's running the mill until the time he dies, at least as far as we know. And Bill, have you dragged anything else up that would shed any more light on that? Or I'll leave it at this point, but unless you have something to add to that.
All I know is the tiny bit that, first of all, he came here apparently from Sullivan, Maine. But he was originally, he and his brother were both from the south Boston South Shore.
Yeah, right.
Marshfield.
Right.
And
that I overlooked.
His brother came after he did. His brother's children were all born in Marshfield. So there's some disconnect there that's going to be interesting to investigate. But Ford was declared insane by his brother and wife, and upon the testimony of the 3 selectmen of Bristol. And 2 years later, he applied to the court after this inventory had been taken to be declared sane again.
Thank you.
The same 3 selectmen declared he was sane. So and we don't have an answer.
I had not heard that from you. So thank you. So I knew it was fishy. I just couldn't put my finger on it. I thought it was some kind of political, who knows. But anyway, but the other factors pointed to the fact that this guy seems to be pretty sane if he's running a business and is quite successful, and one of the most well-to-do individuals in Bristol at the time. So great. We'll have a little more conversation about that over time. So in this document, we will see. Actually, let's back up for a minute here. This is an interesting feature here while we're at it. Now again, not having done any dendrochronology on this, we don't know. But what we're looking at here, and this is when I was poking around. I know other people had found these, but I don't know if the second one was located. Right here, we're looking at a semicircle that would have held the millstone, one of the 2 millstones, for a grist mill. And we know that he ran a grist mill along with a sawmill, along with a carding mill, and a fulling mill. This is Oakman Ford. So this is a neat artifact that is up in the ceiling on the first floor. Let's see, this is in the basement looking up to what would be the underside of the first floor of the mill building. I poked around and looked down towards where the mill pond would be out this way, and I found another one that was even bigger than this. Where they were originally in the building, this has been the big story as far as the mill building, not just me saying this, but Phil, etc. A lot of stuff was recycled, which is not unusual. Looking at this, for example, here, this could have been recycled. This piece here where the the tenon would have fit in this mortise hole here. There's others that you saw up above, or I saw when I was down below. But anyway, at least it's a neat artifact tied in with what his business was, part of that operation. And keep in mind, those of you who haven't heard this before, you can have one building with 3 or 4 different operations, but they can't typically go on at the same time. So that's how you are able to have a carding mill, a grist mill, a sawmill, etc. And they occupy different space. What was interesting about, and what you won't see here, and I did take pictures but didn't include them here, is that this had made me really suspicious that there was something. It was a load-bearing piece because you have these massive summer beams overhead that are about 18 inches across, and these considerable, as you can see here, pit sawn or vertical up and down sawn vertical posts supporting this whole feature here that may have been supporting the actual grist mill operation itself. Now that's just a very simple elementary interpretation on my part, but something to think about. Here is that part of that document that was generated by declaring Oakman Ford insane. And it says a lot to me and to, hopefully to you folks. So 1842, one-story dwelling house. So that would have been the house across the street that we just saw a few minutes ago. One barn, one store. He was also in the retail business. We have some account books talking about that. A three-story building, which is the mill that stands today, containing a grist mill, fulling mill, and this gets even better, looms for manufacturing, and 1/2 of a sawmill, valued at $5,000. That's a chunk of change. Then we get into this, and before I lost my sad sob story, folder full of notes and deeds and whatever last fall, I had a great image of a double carding machine from around 1860. So can't show you that. $400, that again is quite an investment. Picking machine, what's that doing? That's picking basically the dirt and debris out of the cotton that they own. He's getting from buying cotton from other farmers in the area. James Partridge over my neck of the woods, Colonial Pemaquid, he had 300 sheep in 1860. He would have been, I bet you, a customer to Oakman Ford. A lot of dye stuff. What's that for? Dyeing your textiles, your wool, etc. This all like is crying out, man, this is great. 2 cloth brushes. That I'm not so sure of, but maybe brushes for the dye. I'm just guessing on that one. Shearing machine. Found one of those too. $20. That's basically a mechanized means of cutting or shearing the sheep's wool off. Dozen press plates. $24. Press plates. Carding. You're pressing your wool. Oil. 2 gallons. And he's buying, not only has it here, but he's buying it from Francis Wheeler. And that's probably lubricant. It could be some other stuff, but I'm pretty sure of that. A shingle machine. $100. I had another nice picture of that too. But circular saw, that makes sense, 1842. At this point in time, technologically, you're looking at turbines being introduced. Well, actually a little bit later. They're introduced earlier, but up here, probably not because you're off the beaten path. So the turbine we have, and I'll point to that later on, is a bit later, and not Oakman Ford, quite possibly William Ford, his son. A mill saw, that is your up and down saw. The older one that could have been a saw from early years when it was still owned by Jane Given or even Robert Given. Oops, back up here, Neil. Oh, come on. And this is 9,000 pine shingles. Well, isn't that a surprise? 21,000 spruce and hemlock shingles, not singles. And then 3/16 of part of the Schooner Mary. So one, we're looking at some of the wood that he's using. Not earth-shattering, but at least we can see the consistency, because you'll see another bill in a little bit that has pretty much the same type of woods being used. The Schooner Mary, don't know much about that other than that it shows up in this inventory. But again, why does he have a schooner? Why does he have the Vandalier later on in 1845? He can ship now his goods down to Portland, to Boston, pick up stuff there, get some sales, get some more equipment for his carding and fulling mill, etc., etc. And he can make some money because there'll be other people that will buy in on that operation. In this case, 3/16. So that's a fairly valuable ship if he's only 3 parts of that ownership. And this is something that's not, I did not mention, but Robert Given owned 2 ships at his death. So again, probably the same dynamics going on here. He has the infrastructure, the machinery, but he also has a means of transporting what he's producing elsewhere in New England, which is pretty key if you're going to make it as a big time guy. Now this is a gem. It's a little hard to read, and that's fine. The point that I was trying to get across to you folks, this is Gene Rottner's account, one of the account books. This is Oakland Ford's, and I found this years ago when I was still digging over there, and I had gone in and said, Gene, can I take a look at another one of your account books? And she'd generously lend them to me. 6 months later, I come back with it. Can I give you this one and take that one back? In this, I found 10 pages. And 10 pages of pure gold. What you're looking at here, and this isn't even the most detailed, and it's unfortunately I cut it off here on the other side. Oh, crud. These are different individuals. Oakman Ford, where he's lending his oxen. We got George Holding over here, and I can't read, I should remember. Oxen, William Nichols, work, oxen per, we don't identify who that is. Oxen, I think that's 14 days. Over here, you will see a series of hash marks, and then an account. And you got, the whole page is filled with accounts, and they have the first and last names of each of these people. So what you're looking at, one guy's identified as a joiner. Wonder why a joiner. Carpenters, you name it. Possibly a blacksmith mixed in there. As I backtrack and look at some of these names, we can determine most likely what that person was giving in labor, whether it's his oxen or just general labor expertise as a joiner, as a carpenter, a ship's carpenter, etc. 10 pages of this, not only of that, but the remaining 8 pages are devoted to a day-by-day account of purchases that Oakman Ford and the party of 5, and he's identified up here, where they just say, I should know this by now, but anyway, the vessel which has been begun, and they identify in Oakman Ford at the bottom here. So he has 5 partners. And these accounts take you from laying the keel to the launching party. And they identify where the mill, where some of the lumber is coming from, what type of lumber it is, the anchor stock, spars, and everything you imagine. 1845. So it's still fairly early to have a document like that and can pinpoint it to the person and to the damn site that it was being done on. So this is a huge thing that will be used well beyond my days.
Are the names on the left-hand side, for example, I see William Nichols.
Yep.
Would that be then a Nichols probably from...
Nichols, Newcastle, and the Nicholses predate the Partridges in the Ford House over at Colonial Pemaquid. They go back to 1755 or so, thereabouts. But yeah, yep,
Thanks.
yes. Yeah, this is just amazing, amazing. And here is interesting, 1846, a year later. So they built the ship by the fall of 45. Oakman Ford and these other. Now, it looks like they're selling it to some Boston merchants. So that's kind of interesting in that short period of time, but to Boston. So again, archives, mass archives. What could be found down there might give us some more leads into what he's doing, what kind of business Oakman is doing down there, what's he selling, what's he purchasing, etc. I mean, that's a jump, but not totally. So, and this he's doing, I think, also with his, what is he? Yeah, Benjamin. So this would be his son, one of his sons. Crud. Oh, come on. This, by the way, are the ship's ways. And this is as of about 3 weeks ago I took this picture. At sort of mid-tide, and you can see...
Is it below the mill pond, right at the head of the tide?
Yes, yep, but so you'd have to walk, well actually you know what you do? You know where the old alewives, the concrete foundation to that, just walk over there and walk on the shore and you'll find it. And it's, the tides have played a number on, also the winter ice flows have chewed it up a bit since I first saw it. And anyway, so this is what we're looking at right here. The keel would have been built here and extended up an unknown distance. Nick Dean, the late Nick Dean basically identified this and showed it to me probably in the late 80s or so. And he speculated as to the width between these two timbers here and the unknown distance, what kind of ships it could have built. And you're probably talking about a ship 60, maybe 100 tons. There was another ship built in 1872 by the Sproul brothers, father and son, and I'm blanking out right now. I was fortunate enough when we were digging that year someone told me about it locally, a painting of, it wasn't the Laureata, I don't think. Anyway, she was 62 feet long, a beam of about 18 and about 40 tons. Had a painting of it, launched in 1872 on that same site. So we have two ships that we know of, and then apparently Richard Fawcett, Gene Rottner's grandfather, built a boat down there in the 1940s. So there was boat building of one sort or another up to fairly recent times and possibly again back into the late 1600s. Now we're jumping a bit into post Oakman Ford. As I said, he dies in 1865, has a quite lucrative business in a variety of different purposes. We're now looking at the neighborhood, Pemaquid Falls, as it appeared around 1910. This would be the mill building backside here, so you see that one addition here. That would have been the barn to the Rodner's house, which was right here, I think, but maybe here. Anyway, and that barn, boy, I'm looking at that and it looks like an English style. That may be, I think, an 18th century barn, which is killer. So that could have possibly been Robert Gibbons. This is where his place was.
So on that map, where would the Poole brothers buildings?
Right here. This is the same build. Oops. Oh, here we go again. Okay, I can't, so the fishways, I don't have anything much to add to it other than what most people here know, I'm assuming. The fishways, the ones that you see now were built in the 30s, 40s, and there was an upgrade, I think, more recently than that, because there was that run. I mean, Bobby, anybody here can chime in on that. The foundation I was referring to down on the water side, where they actually were processing alewives, was that has a date of, I think, 1979 or 82 on that. It went defunct soon after that. But essentially what the fishways were set up, is everybody familiar with how that works? It gives alewives, anadromous fish, a way around a mill or the dam itself so that they can continue to run, spawn, and then die. Interestingly enough, they were issuing licenses as early as 1765 in the town of Bristol. And I would not be surprised that they weren't doing the same thing going back even further than that. But what does that tell you? If you're issuing licenses, the chances are, one, alewives are important to the local populace as bait fish, and two, possibly because you're the danger of over-harvesting what you have. And that's why it's done now, along with the industrial challenges that they have too, as far as alewives go. So that has a long story also, the whole fishway process. Did that answer your question, Walt, partially?
Somewhat.
Well,
there are various trays there. Some are upstream, some are downstream.
right.
And what's done in each case, and is it survivable through the winter with all ice and
Right.
etc.?
It's the same challenge for the mills themselves. They have problems with running in the winter time. And that's where the turbine is a little bit different. But anyway, and those of you up at Bristol Mill, same, there's a fishway up there too. So same idea. Anybody else want to add anything to that? What Walt said? And so again, what we see this number of activities going on in the same piece of property. It can work sometimes and other times it can't. In the case of Native Americans and English folks, it came to blows, where you're competing for the same stretch of water and they're both fishing And they're mad at the English because they're fishing too much. They're too efficient. And they're cleaning out what they've relied on for thousands of years. And I understand that point. So that's oftentimes what went on between the Native Americans and Europeans, but particularly the English in New England, stemmed from competition over similar or the same resources. Land, animal, hides, etc. So,
You know, it looks very dry. It looks like it's...
well, we're in the middle, most likely, of July or August in that. And if you want to come sometime and dig there in the summertime, it does get very dry there.
No kidding.
Again, I don't know if this adds anything to what what you might be raising here. We'd be looking at the mill pond right in here. This over here is where you'll see in that next image a wagon with a team of 2 horses and a better view of the mill. Circa. Thank you. Thank you. And this, unfortunately, is not the best image. There's another one that's even better than this one. But essentially, what's amazing about this photograph is that you can see the dam right here, stone dam, granite, some of which still survives today. You can see essentially it's hard to see in here, the other image that I have, thanks to OBHS, you can see the trash rack, which is a series of wooden, typically posts that are driven in the ground just where the penstock or the water that rushes through to power the turbine or the water wheel, so that doesn't get in there and muck up the works. It traps that stuff before it gets down the penstock. And then our platform, there, I try it again. Right here, you can actually see that as it extends out to the gravel dirt area here. And here is one of our additions with the logs being pulled up out of the mill pond into, and you can see, I think, the frame to basically the mill itself, the carriage, where they would have been pulled up. And I don't think I have it in my images here, but basically the cable that is still, most of you have probably seen the cable that would have hauled the logs up at that point in time. And that process may be quite a bit later, maybe late 1800s, how that worked. And then a team of horses here with the wagon hauling out some timber, cut lumber, and out back are some of your cut long lumber pieces here. Here's another shot. There's the mill pond, and right over here should be Gene Rottner's place. And there's the Redmond's Hall, as Bobby had pointed out, and here we go again. And this is presumably part of, and again, feel free to throw in your comments here. One, we have, look at the stock of, here's our turbine. And when I first saw that, I thought, well, that's quite interesting in that you have a big chunk of the works, not only the turbine, but the beveled gears that we'll see in a minute here. You can see the mill race here. Well, actually there you can't see it, but the one wall to the other side of the mill race. And not only that, but we actually found a cover plate that would have covered on the left side here a big opening that could have been unscrewed to get at the works if the mechanical, there was some problem, the turbine had to be replaced or whatnot. And here's another view of it. And this is circa 2008. The innards of the turbine, and Chase Manufacturing Company, Orange, Massachusetts. And I looked high and low, and as yet haven't found anything ascribed to, at least that's online, or a document that shows them making turbines any earlier than 1862 or so. And if we look, if I get to it, we don't run by it again, we'll see this image here. I found this in the main register about 2 months ago. That's an ad for Chase Turbine Manufacturing Company. At this point, they're in Portland. Now, that may just be a distributor, but look at the similarity between that guy and this guy and this guy. From the legs to the inside, and now the only thing we don't see is the propeller, but, or what do you want to call it, actually the turbine itself. Now what's good about these is that they're a lot more efficient. If you compare that with a water wheel, either overshot or undershot, those things are huge. And with this, you don't have to have as much water, and it's concentrated when it comes to this penstock that we might see. Well, you have to trust me on that. These are the beveled gears. There's the penstock. And that ran all the way up to the north edge foundation to the mill building and the mill pond itself. And that is where the water would be rushing through, and it would have fed right into that metal portion of the turbine, and then would have turned that propeller-like thing that would have generated all the belts and pulleys that you've either seen in real time or seeing tonight, hopefully. I can back that up. And there's one of them. That is essentially the top of the turbine, the cover right here. And these are all wood gears. So they can be removed and replaced and put back. That is pretty well frozen tight, but with some work, potentially it might be at least fixed. And there's the cover plate. Chase CT MFG Company, Orange, Mass. So pretty cool. Orange, that's out Western Mass. So what we're looking at here, again, is a continuation of what we saw with Oakman Ford, is a bill that's issued in this case by a business of William Boyd and William Ford. They're in partnership. William Ford is in business at least until 1909. I found evidence of him showing up in the main register again, and he's still running, I think, a sawmill and a carding mill. I'd have to refresh my memory on that. But nonetheless, what's great about this is it covers a fairly long period of time. One customer from 1873 to 1890, and in that, virtually everything you see there is cut lumber of one form or another. And again, pine, spruce, that's being cut at the Ford mill. And with the Ford, presumably, turbine that we just saw a few minutes ago. Now, things change. So they continue until, let's say, around 1909, 1910. And again, give or take a few years here. So by the time you get into the early 20s, the milling industry in general, in particular in towns like Pemaquid Falls, Bristol itself, has been on a long slide since the Civil War. They are servicing more and more local needs, not big operation, or not producing stuff for, clients down in Boston or Portland or whatnot. But they do continue, and that's where the Poole brothers, because they have a longer legacy, pick up after having left Damascove and set up shop in the Bristol and Pemaquid area and run this mill until 2010, 9, thereabouts, when we go to La Valleys and then finally Hammonds. And this is one of the sort of final interesting pieces of my story, well, the mill story. My story, I found something similar to this, is that when I was poking around in 2007-8, I found some interesting mortised rectangular pieces of wood that had been tied together, 3 sections. And just happened to the same year come across this ad for a circular saw, a portable sawmill. Portable in the sense that you could move them around, but if you look at this thing, it's not something you're going to tie your car to or your wagon to and just haul up. But it is portable in that it's not in a building. And that's what Chester and Carl Sr. had operating behind the mill building in the 20s, 30s, and I think beyond, and limited use of the mill building as an operating sawmill. And I say that based more on one statement and I know others could support this. Jean Rottner mentioned to me earlier this year when she was a teenager that their dog got out of the house and it got on the logs over in the mill pond and was running around, and Chester or Carl Sr. Rescued the dog. So hey, great story, but once again, a little snippet that is giving you some evidence again of this mill still operating, albeit on much reduced circumstances. You still had a mill pond there. When I came here in the late 70s or 75, I talked with Craig Lehman, and even before that, Bill Fitzpatrick, ex-selectman, long gone, moved up from Mass. John, thank you. Anyway, he said that when he came here from Mass in like the late 50s, 57, I think he worked at the mill, and he said it was still operating. Now again, what that means, whether they're actually running a circular saw, I don't know. That's possible. We're getting some conflicting info here and there when we get that close to recent times. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. So what my takeaway from all this is that you have a gem, an archaeological gem, an architectural gem, a amazing array of oral history, thanks to the stories that people today, that the local natives still remember, that can tie us not only to the last 20 years, but 100 years, 150 years, and then ultimately through the archaeological tools that we have, take us back 5,000 years to a site that served different purposes to many different people, from the Native American folks that lived there to the English folks that followed suit. And I would put another plug for the Native American story, that hopefully will be a big part of this. It's something I'm dealing with over at Pemaquid, trying to get more out there. And where they shared common resources too, successfully in some cases, not in others. But anyway, thank you very much. Those of you who came for a second time, hopefully having some visuals has helped a bit, aside from my constant technical problems here. We made it. And it's 8:30. Any questions? I don't know how, 5-10 minutes or not?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Just to add to your story, we now found Poole Brothers portable mill. We have found the mill that the Poole Brothers used as a portable mill.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I didn't. Damn it!
We actually found the actual mill from that.
Yeah, there it is. There it is.
It's not that.
That's the way. If you look at that, it's got the track on it that it would run off of.
That's a portable mill.
Yes.
We found the one that came from Poole Brothers.
Well, this is right in. Why wouldn't it have been used by them?
You're missing the point, but that's okay.
What am I missing?
We have the whole mill.
The carriage and the sawmill itself.
Where
1966.
where was that?
It was bought in 1966 and taken to Newcastle.
Ah.
We are negotiating to get it back.
Oh.
The actual-
Great.
Actual mill.
So, well, this, I don't know if it will let me, I guess that's it. Anyway, that's another part of a portable sawmill. So you have one intact and one partially intact. So great, cool. Anybody else? Yes?
What would you be most excited about to find at this site? What are you most looking for? Boy, if I can only find this.
Well, the evidence of the 17th century mill operation, whether it's just any equipment tied in with that, water wheel fragments. I mean, again, I may be off base, but that's for me would be along with evidence of the families that were there in the second half of the 1600s. That's what initially got me up there in 2001, is that I was looking for Thomas Giles's farmstead and didn't find that, but that did move into the Given era. So that and then evidence of early shipbuilding on that property. But Alex Baudet's property might hold some elements that could tie in with that early reference to the mill, but who knows. I dug over there in the mid 80s and came up with stuff, but nothing going back to that time period. So there's still a lot of question marks, but anyway, anybody else?
When we bought the boat shop barn, Ed Penniman, who owned it, had said that that barn had been built with a portable mill on Boyd's Pond, on Huey's Neck right there. And that it was part of Poole Brothers, but it was right there, right on the pond itself.
Wow.
So it might have been another one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, that's ultimately the exciting part too, is the stories that we're hearing of people having artifacts that they've held on to for years, and now there's an opportunity to add to the story that we're trying to put together, and in some cases hopefully end up in the mill building.
Sure.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Neil, thank you.
Yep.